It was one of those chilly mornings in late October, when the air outside the small-town school carried the scent of rain and freshly fallen leaves. Inside the narrow music hall, the sound of piano notes drifted softly through the corridors. A few students were practicing for the upcoming recital, their melodies echoing against the old wooden walls. Among them sat a quiet girl, her fingers resting nervously on the keys of an old upright piano that had seen better days. She wasn't the type who drew attention. In fact, most people in school barely noticed her beyond her gentle smile and calm presence in class. She kept to herself, usually sitting in the second row, never the front, never the back. She wasn't loud, nor was she shy in the usual sense, just quietly thoughtful, the kind of person who preferred listening to speaking. But for those who paid attention, there was always something about her eyes, something that said she had stories that she never told. That morning, the music teacher, an older woman with gray hair tied into a bun, walked into the room with a clipboard in her hand. She looked over the students as they practiced, occasionally stopping to adjust a note, give advice, or remind someone to slow down. When she reached the piano, she paused. The girl at the keys was playing softly, barely touching the notes, her hands moving gently as if afraid to disturb the silence around her. "You're playing beautifully," the teacher said kindly, "but you're holding back again." The girl stopped playing and looked up, startled. "I'm sorry," she said quietly. "No need to be sorry," the teacher replied with a smile. "You just need to trust yourself more. The recital is next week, and I'd like you to play something simple, something you enjoy. Don't think too hard about impressing anyone. Just feel the music." The girl nodded, but her teacher noticed the hesitation in her expression. "You can do it," the teacher said, patting her shoulder before walking away to check on another student. After she left, the girl sat there for a moment, staring at the keys. Her hands trembled slightly. She had been told to keep it simple, but inside her heart a quiet conflict began to stir. She wanted to do more than just play a simple tune. She wanted to play something that would speak for her, something that could express what words never could. But she wasn't sure if she still had it in her, the confidence, the strength, or the skill. When practice ended, she packed her sheet music carefully into a worn folder and walked home through the cold breeze. Her small town was peaceful. Rows of brick houses, a corner bakery that smelled of cinnamon, and a few children running down the street chasing the last golden leaves of autumn. It was ordinary, familiar, and safe, but as she walked, her mind wandered back to the piano. Every step echoed her doubt. Just play something simple, her teacher had said. But could she really? At home, her mother greeted her at the door, smiling warmly. "You're late again," she said, wiping her hands on a dish towel. "Did you stay after class to practice?" The girl nodded. "The recital's coming up," her mother smiled, though there was a hint of worry in her eyes. "Don't push yourself too hard," she said. "Remember, it's supposed to be fun." "I know," the girl replied softly, then went straight to the living room where an old upright piano stood near the window. Its paint had chipped in places, and one of the keys stuck a little when pressed too hard, but it was her favorite place in the world. She ran her fingers lightly over the keys before sitting down. Outside, the rain had started again, tapping against the glass. Inside, she began to play. At first, it was slow, careful, the same simple melody she always practiced. But as the minutes passed, something changed. Her hands began to move more freely. The notes flowed together in ways they hadn't before, full of feeling and quiet strength. The music grew louder, filling the small room, echoing softly off the walls. For a moment, she wasn't just a student in a small-town school. She was free. Every note carried a piece of her heart, every pause held a secret memory. She closed her eyes and let the melody take her somewhere far away, somewhere only she could reach. Then suddenly she stopped. The sound faded into silence. Her right hand trembled slightly. She stared at it as if it didn't belong to her. The movement, the strength, it wasn't what it used to be. She flexed her fingers slowly, the pain familiar but unwelcome. It had been 2 years since the accident, and even now, her hand still reminded her of what she had lost. Back then, music had been her life. She had practiced for hours every day, dreaming of performing on big stages someday. But one winter night, everything changed. A car accident left her with nerve damage in her right hand. The doctor said she was lucky to have survived it all. But when they told her she might never play complicated pieces again, it felt like her world had ended. For months, she couldn't even bring herself to look at the piano. But time had a strange way of healing, at least a little. Slowly, she began to practice again. Only with her left hand at first, then both, rebuilding her strength and learning new ways to move her fingers. It was painful, both physically and emotionally, but she refused to give up. The music had been part of her before, and she couldn't let it go. Now, sitting in front of the same piano that had once been her comfort and her pain, she wondered if the recital could be her chance, not just to play again, but to truly come back. Her mother walked in quietly, carrying a cup of tea. "You're playing that piece again," she said gently. "The one you used to love." The girl smiled faintly. "I can't help it. It sounds beautiful," her mother said, placing the cup beside her. "But don't stay up too late. You've been working so hard lately." "I won't," she promised, though she knew she probably would. After her mother left, she continued to play until the sky outside turned dark, and the room was lit only by the small lamp on the piano. Each time her fingers slipped or the pain flared, she paused, took a breath, and started again. There was frustration, yes, but also something deeper, a quiet fire that kept her going. When she finally stopped, she leaned back and stared at the piano keys, feeling both exhausted and alive. She thought about what her teacher had said earlier. Play something simple. Maybe her teacher meant well. Maybe she just didn't believe the girl could handle more. But part of her wanted to show everyone what she was really capable of. Not for applause, not for attention, but to remind herself that she could still do it. The next morning, she walked into school with her sheet music tucked safely under her arm. Her classmates were buzzing about the recital, chatting about what songs they'd chosen. Some joked around, others looked nervous. When one of them asked what piece she was planning to play, she hesitated. "Something simple," she said with a small smile. It was easier than explaining the truth. During lunch, she sat alone under a tree behind the music hall. From there, she could hear faint notes drifting from inside, someone practicing scales, another playing a bright, cheerful tune. She listened quietly, her fingers tapping on her knee in rhythm. Then she pulled out her folded sheet music and stared at it. It wasn't simple. It wasn't safe. But it was hers. As the week went by, the air grew colder and the anticipation for the recital filled the school. Posters were taped up in hallways. Teachers reminded students to bring their families, and the janitor polished the small auditorium until the wooden floor gleamed under the lights. Every afternoon, the girl stayed behind after class, practicing when the halls were empty and the only sound was the piano echoing softly in the stillness. Sometimes, her teacher would pass by and listen quietly from the doorway. The older woman never said much, just a nod here, a gentle smile there, but she noticed something different in the girl's playing. There was feeling, depth, something that went beyond the notes on the page. It was the kind of sound that came from experience, from struggle, from someone who had lived through silence and found her way back to music. One evening, after everyone else had gone, the teacher approached her. "You've been working hard," she said softly. The girl nodded. "I just want to do my best." "You will," the teacher said kindly. "Remember, music isn't about being perfect. It's about connection. When you play, let people hear your heart. That's what matters." The girl smiled, though her chest tightened with emotion. She wanted to believe that. She wanted to believe that even with her flaws, her music could still reach someone. That night, as she walked home under the dim streetlights, she replayed her teacher's words in her mind. The streets were quiet, the air cool against her skin. She thought about the day of the recital, about stepping onto the stage, about the people watching, about the silence before the first note. It scared her, but it also thrilled her. Somewhere deep inside, she knew she was ready. Maybe not perfectly ready, but enough. When she reached home, she looked through the window and saw her mother dozing on the couch, a blanket around her shoulders. The soft hum of the old radio filled the room. For a moment, the girl stood outside, just watching, the world around her calm and still. Then she turned back to the piano once more. She sat down and placed her fingers on the keys. Her hands shook slightly, but she smiled anyway. The rain had stopped and the night outside was silent. Slowly, she began to play, not for her teacher, not for her classmates, not even for the recital. She played for herself, and in that quiet room, surrounded by shadows and soft light, she made a promise she didn't say out loud. "Next week, I won't play something simple. I'll play something true." The week before the recital passed faster than anyone expected. The small school auditorium was buzzing with energy every day. Students carried their sheet music through the halls, whispering about what they would play, some excited, others nervous. Teachers decorated the stage with soft lights and red curtains that had faded a little over the years, but still gave the place a warm glow. Amid all that, the quiet girl spent most of her free time in the practice room. It was a small square space tucked away behind the main hall, with walls that carried the faint smell of old wood and polish. There was only one piano there, an instrument that had gone slightly out of tune but still held a charm of its own. That was where she felt most at peace, just her, the keys, and the sound of music filling the empty air. Every afternoon after classes ended, she sat down and practiced. The first few minutes were always slow. She warmed up her fingers carefully, testing her right hand to make sure it didn't stiffen too quickly. She knew her limits. The accident had changed her hand forever. Sometimes the pain was just a dull ache. Other times it burned like fire through her wrist, especially when she tried to move too fast, but she didn't stop. She never stopped. The piece she had chosen was one she had loved since she was little, a song her father used to play on their old piano before he left for work early in the mornings. It wasn't an easy piece, not at all. It had sections that demanded speed, strength, and perfect timing. 2 years ago she could play it effortlessly, but now every note felt like climbing a mountain. Each day she improved little by little. Her left hand grew stronger, more confident, and her right hand followed, hesitating at times but never giving up. Some nights she returned home with her fingers sore and her shoulders tense, but she always smiled. Music was more than sound to her. It was a conversation between her heart and the world, one that didn't need words. Her teacher noticed the change. She never said much about it, but she watched closely. During class, she saw how the girl's movements were more focused, how she seemed lost in her music, like someone chasing something invisible but meaningful. The teacher often thought about saying something, perhaps to remind her not to push herself too hard, but each time she saw the determination in the girl's eyes, she stayed silent. At home, things were quiet as usual. Her mother worked long hours at a local shop, coming home late and tired. Yet every night when she entered the house and heard the faint sound of the piano, a soft smile spread across her face. It was a familiar comfort, proof that her daughter was still fighting, still holding on to the things she loved most. One evening, after dinner, her mother asked gently, "Are you nervous about the recital?" The girl hesitated, then shrugged. "A little. I don't know if I can play it perfectly." "You don't have to be perfect," her mother said, sitting down beside her. "You just have to be honest. People will feel it when you play with your heart." She nodded slowly. "I want to play something that means something," she said quietly. "Something that tells my story." Her mother's eyes softened. "Then that's exactly what you should do." That night after her mother went to bed, the girl sat alone at the piano again. She placed her fingers gently on the keys, her heart calm but her thoughts racing. Every note she played reminded her of the journey she had taken since the accident. The fear, the pain, the nights when she cried because her hand wouldn't move the way she wanted it to, and then the mornings when she tried again anyway. As she played, she could almost hear the echo of her old self, the confident young pianist she used to be before everything changed. But she didn't miss that version of herself anymore. This version, the one who had fought her way back, who learned patience and persistence, was stronger. She wasn't trying to prove anything to anyone anymore. She just wanted to share what she had learned, that even when something breaks, it can still create something beautiful. In the days leading up to the recital, she began waking up earlier than usual. Before school, she practiced quietly while the world outside was still waking up. The sunlight coming through the window painted the piano keys in gold. Sometimes she stopped just to look at them, black and white, side by side, so different yet inseparable. It reminded her of life itself, light and dark, pain and joy, all woven together. At school, some of her classmates started noticing her more. A few of them whispered that she was working too hard, that she looked tired. One even asked if she was planning to compete professionally. She just smiled and said, "No, I just want to play well." One afternoon, the teacher announced that there would be a short rehearsal on stage so everyone could get used to the space. The students gathered in the small auditorium, their laughter filling the air as they teased one another and practiced bits of their songs. When it was her turn, she walked onto the stage quietly. She had stood on that same stage before, but this time it felt different. The bright lights made her squint and her heart beat faster. She sat down on the piano bench, took a deep breath, and began to play. The first few notes came out softer than she wanted, but soon her hands found their rhythm. The sound filled the room, calm but full of emotion. When she finished, there was a moment of silence. The other students didn't clap. It was just a rehearsal after all. But a few of them looked surprised. Even the teacher's expression softened. She had played with feeling, and everyone could sense it. As she stood to leave the stage, her teacher said, "That was lovely. You've grown a lot these past months." She smiled shyly. "Thank you." The teacher hesitated before adding, "Just remember, don't overdo it. Let the music breathe." She nodded, though she knew she would still keep practicing every night until the recital. She couldn't help it. Music was the only way she knew how to talk about the things she couldn't say out loud. That weekend, her mother took a day off from work to spend time with her. They went for a walk in the park near the lake. The trees had started turning shades of red and orange, their reflections rippling in the water. It was quiet, peaceful. "I still remember the first time you touched a piano," her mother said as they walked. "You were only 5 and you wouldn't stop pressing the keys." The girl laughed softly. "I just liked the sound." "You still do," her mother smiled. "No matter what happens, don't lose that. Don't let fear take away what you love." Those words stayed with her long after they went home. That night, when she sat down to practice, she felt something different inside her. A calm sort of strength. The fear was still there, yes, but it was smaller now. Almost quiet. She played through the piece from start to finish without stopping. Her right hand stumbled only once, but she didn't flinch. She kept going. When the last note faded, she sat still for a while, listening to the silence that followed. It was the same silence she used to dread, the silence that came after failure, after pain, but now it felt peaceful. The next morning, her teacher handed out the final program for the recital. The girl's name was listed somewhere in the middle. She traced it with her finger, smiling to herself. It wasn't about being first or last anymore. It was about being there. On the day before the recital, she stayed late after everyone had gone home. The janitor passed by once, offering a polite nod, and she smiled back before continuing to play. She practiced the hardest part again and again, her fingers finding their place almost naturally now. It still hurt sometimes, but it didn't scare her anymore. Pain had become part of the rhythm, part of the music. When she finally stood up to leave, she turned off the light and looked back at the piano one last time. "Tomorrow," she whispered, "I'll show them who I really am." As she walked home under the streetlights, the wind carried the faint smell of rain again. It reminded her of the night she first promised herself she'd never give up. Everything had led to this: the struggle, the late nights, the quiet tears, the moments of doubt. Tomorrow wasn't just another performance. It was proof that even broken things could create something beautiful. That night, she barely slept. Not because she was nervous, but because she couldn't stop hearing the music in her head. Every note, every pause played over and over until it became part of her heartbeat. She lay in bed with her eyes open, smiling in the dark. Morning came slowly, sunlight spilling across her room. She sat up, stretched her tired arms, and looked at her hands. Her fingers still felt stiff, but there was something powerful about them. Not perfect, not fast, but steady. Strong. She walked to the piano one last time before heading to school. The room was quiet. She took a deep breath, closed her eyes, and played the opening line of her piece. It sounded warm, alive, like a story waiting to be told. When she finished, she rested her hands on the keys, feeling a soft calm spread through her chest. Whatever happened that evening didn't matter anymore. She was ready. She had already won, not by being flawless, but by refusing to stop trying. The day of the recital arrived with a quiet chill in the air. The sky outside was pale gray, and a soft wind carried the smell of autumn leaves through the schoolyard. Inside the small auditorium, everything was coming to life. The faint sound of chairs being arranged, the buzz of parents talking, and the soft hum of instruments being tuned. Backstage, the students gathered in small groups, whispering nervously and adjusting their clothes. Some were laughing to ease their tension, others fidgeted with their sheet music, and a few stared silently at the stage curtain, lost in thought. The girl stood apart from them, holding her music folder close to her chest. Her heart was beating fast, not out of fear, but something deeper, a mixture of excitement and disbelief that the day had finally come. She took a deep breath and looked around the room. The other students had always seen her as quiet, maybe even a little fragile. No one knew how much this moment meant to her. No one knew the late nights, the pain, or the promise she had made to herself. Today was the day she would keep that promise. Her teacher walked in, smiling gently as she looked over her students. "Everyone ready?" she asked, her voice calm but encouraging. "Remember, this isn't a competition. Just enjoy the music and let the audience feel what you feel." The students nodded. The teacher's gaze lingered on the girl for a moment longer than the rest. She gave her a small nod, one of quiet understanding, before turning away. The recital began soon after. One by one, students stepped onto the stage. The audience applauded politely after each performance. There were cheerful violin pieces, soft flute melodies, and a few songs sung by nervous but brave voices. The girl sat in the waiting area, listening to each performance through the curtain. She tried to focus, but her thoughts kept drifting. Her hands rested in her lap, fingers twitching slightly as if her body was already preparing for what was coming. Her mother was sitting somewhere in the audience near the front. She hadn't told her what piece she was going to play. She wanted it to be a surprise. She imagined her mother's face when she began, how her eyes might widen in recognition, how her expression would soften with pride. That thought gave her a small spark of courage. After what felt like hours, the teacher's voice called her name. Her stomach tightened. For a moment, the world seemed to go silent except for the sound of her own heartbeat. She stood slowly, clutching her music sheet even though she no longer needed it. Her fingers brushed against the worn paper one last time before she set it down on the stand by the door. She didn't need the notes anymore. They were already written inside her. As she stepped onto the stage, the lights felt brighter than she remembered. They washed over her, warm and blinding. The sound of the crowd faded into a low murmur. She could see the outline of faces in the audience, parents, teachers, friends, but she didn't focus on them. She found her mother in the front row and caught a glimpse of her smile. That was enough. She walked to the piano and sat down slowly, adjusting the bench to just the right height. Her hands rested gently on her lap. For a moment, she just breathed, feeling the quiet of the room. Her teacher walked up beside her and whispered softly, "Remember what I said. Keep it simple and just enjoy it." The girl nodded, but her eyes stayed on the keys. Her teacher gave her shoulder a reassuring pat and stepped away. The silence in the auditorium stretched out, heavy and expectant. She could feel everyone waiting. She lifted her hands and placed them on the piano, her fingers trembling slightly. The first few notes came softly, the simple tune her teacher had suggested. It was calm, delicate, like the beginning of a story that everyone had heard before. The audience smiled, thinking it would be a sweet, easy piece to listen to. But as she played those familiar notes, her heart began to race. The music sounded beautiful, but it wasn't her. It wasn't what she wanted to say. The notes felt small compared to everything she had carried inside all this time. The pain, the fear, the strength she had built. Halfway through the melody, she paused for a fraction of a second. It was barely noticeable to anyone else, but in that pause, she made her decision. Her fingers shifted slightly. The next note she played was not part of the simple tune. It was deeper, fuller, carrying emotion that filled the silence like a sudden rush of wind. Her teacher looked up from the front row, her expression changing slowly from curiosity to disbelief. The audience leaned forward. The girl's hands began to move faster, smoother, with purpose. The melody transformed into something powerful, something alive. The song she had chosen was not simple at all. It was one of the most challenging piano pieces ever written, one that required not just skill but heart. Her right hand, once weak and uncertain, moved across the keys with surprising strength. Every note carried a story of her struggle, her fear, her determination. She wasn't thinking anymore. She was simply feeling. The sound filled the room, rising and falling like a storm. Her body swayed slightly with the rhythm. The audience watched in complete silence. Some of them had seen her play before, but never like this. This wasn't a performance. It was something real, something raw. The music climbed higher, faster, until it felt like the entire room was breathing with her. Her hand started to ache halfway through, but she didn't stop. The pain was part of it now. It reminded her of how far she had come. She pushed through, her face calm but focused. The teacher's eyes glistened as she watched from the front row. She knew what the girl was doing, and she knew exactly how hard it was. For a moment, she worried that her hand wouldn't hold up, but as the notes kept flowing, her worry turned into pride. The final part of the piece came, the most difficult section. Her fingers flew across the piano faster than they ever had before. It was as if every late night of practice, every quiet tear, every moment of doubt was being released all at once through the sound. Then came the last chord, strong, resonant, and perfect. The sound lingered in the air, echoing through the hall before slowly fading into silence. For a second, no one moved. No one even breathed. Then, all at once, the room erupted into applause. It started as a few claps, hesitant, surprised, and then grew louder and louder until the sound filled the entire auditorium. People stood up, cheering, clapping, calling out her name. Some of the students backstage peeked out from behind the curtain, their eyes wide with amazement. Her teacher was on her feet too, clapping harder than anyone. The girl sat there frozen, her hands still resting on the keys. The noise around her felt distant, almost unreal. She looked out at the crowd, dazed, her chest rising and falling as she caught her breath. Then she saw her mother standing in the front row, tears shining in her eyes, smiling wider than she ever had. Something in the girl's chest loosened. Her eyes filled with tears, but she smiled through them. The applause wasn't just for the music. It was for everything she had overcome. She stood slowly and bowed, her hands trembling slightly, not from nerves, but from relief. The lights were warm on her face, the sound of clapping surrounding her like a wave. She didn't need words. The music had already said everything she wanted to say. As she walked off the stage, her teacher met her near the side curtain. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The teacher simply reached out and hugged her gently. That, she whispered softly, was not simple. That was extraordinary. The girl smiled, her voice barely a whisper. I just wanted to play something true. Her teacher nodded, eyes shining. You did. Backstage, some of the other students gathered around her, still buzzing with excitement. That was amazing, one of them said. How did you even play that? I didn't know you could do something like that. She laughed quietly, still catching her breath. I didn't know either, she said softly. When the recital ended and people began to leave, her mother came backstage. She didn't say anything at first, just pulled her daughter into a tight hug. I'm so proud of you, she whispered. I had no idea you were planning to do that. The girl smiled against her shoulder. I wasn't sure I could, she admitted, but I had to try. Her mother pulled back slightly to look at her. You didn't just try, she said. You showed everyone what strength looks like. The girl's eyes filled again, but she just nodded. Later that night, when the auditorium was empty and the lights were dim, she returned to the piano one last time. The room smelled faintly of dust and flowers left behind by parents. She sat down and ran her fingers softly across the keys. There was no audience now, no spotlight, no applause. Just her and the piano, the same way it had always been. She smiled, closed her eyes, and whispered, We did it. Then she played again, quietly this time, not for anyone else, but for herself. The sound was soft and pure, wrapping around the room like a secret only she could hear. It was the sound of someone who had found her voice again. The night of the recital would be remembered by everyone who had been there. For some, it was just another school event, something to talk about for a few days before moving on. But for her, it became the moment her life quietly shifted from what it had been to what it could become. After the applause finally faded, she sat for a few seconds longer at the piano, letting the silence wrap around her. Her hands trembled, but this time it wasn't from fear. It was from the rush of everything that had just happened, the lights, the sound, the energy that had filled the room. She had dreamed about performing again, but the reality of it felt different, deeper. When she stood up, her knees almost gave out, but she managed to smile and bow. The sight of people standing, clapping, cheering, calling her name, felt unreal. Somewhere in that sea of faces, she saw her mother's teary eyes, her teacher's proud smile, and a few classmates staring at her in disbelief. It didn't feel like victory. It felt like release. After the recital ended, the crowd gathered in small groups, chatting excitedly. Parents congratulated their children. Teachers exchanged smiles, and laughter filled the air. The girl stood quietly near the stage. still in her black performance dress, her hair tied neatly back, her cheeks flushed from emotion. A group of students ran up to her, still buzzing with energy. "How did you even do that?" one of them asked. "That piece was impossible." Another said. She laughed softly, shaking her head. "It just took practice." But it wasn't just practice, and she knew it. It was years of quiet struggle, endless nights of pain and patience. Still, she didn't say that out loud. She didn't need to explain. Her teacher approached her a few minutes later, eyes shining. "You made everyone stop breathing for a moment," she said with a smile. "I haven't heard this room so quiet in years," the girl smiled back. "I almost didn't play it." "Then I'm glad you did," her teacher said gently. Sometimes the best music comes from the bravest decisions. When she and her mother finally stepped outside, the night air felt cool and light. The stars were faint behind the clouds, but the moon cast a pale glow over the quiet parking lot. Her mother wrapped her arm around her shoulders as they walked toward the car. "I still can't believe what you did in there," her mother said softly, her voice full of pride. "You had everyone speechless." "I was nervous," the girl admitted. "But once I started, it didn't feel like performing anymore. It just felt right," her mother nodded. "That's because it was you. Not just the music, but your heart in every note." When they got home, she didn't go straight to bed. She sat in front of the piano again, still in her dress, and looked at the keys. The same piano that had seen her lowest days was now the reason she felt alive again. She touched the surface gently, smiling through quiet tears. For a while, she just sat there, not playing, not thinking, just feeling. Then she whispered softly, "We did it," and rested her head on the keys, listening to the faint hum they made in response. The next morning, she woke up to a stream of messages on her phone. Some were from classmates, others from teachers and friends. "You were amazing," one read. "I still can't stop thinking about your performance," said another. She scrolled through them with a smile that she couldn't quite hide. At school, everyone seemed to look at her differently. The same people who once barely noticed her now stopped to congratulate her. Even students from other grades mentioned her name in the hallway. It was strange. She had always blended into the background, and now she felt like the spotlight was following her everywhere. During lunch, her teacher stopped by her table. "Someone recorded your performance last night," she said. "One of the parents uploaded it online." The girl blinked in surprise. "They did?" "Yes," the teacher smiled. "You might want to see it." That evening, when she got home, she found the video easily. It had already gathered hundreds of views with comments from people she didn't even know. "I don't know this girl, but this moved me to tears. Her story is in her music. You can feel her soul in every note." Her hands shook slightly as she scrolled through them. She hadn't done it for attention, but seeing that her music had touched so many people made her heart swell with something she hadn't felt in a long time. Pride, but the quiet kind, the kind that warms you from the inside. Within days, the video spread even further. The local newspaper picked up the story. A reporter reached out to her school asking if they could interview her for a short piece about the student whose music silenced a room. Her teacher and mother encouraged her to agree. The interview was simple. They met at the school auditorium, where she had performed just a week earlier. The reporter asked gentle questions about her love for music, about how she chose the piece, about what the performance meant to her. She spoke softly but honestly. "It wasn't just about playing," she said during the interview. "It was about finding myself again. I had to learn that even when things don't go the way you planned, you can still create something beautiful from it." When the article was published, her story began to travel further than she expected. People she didn't know began sending her messages. Musicians, students, even strangers who said her story gave them courage to keep going. It felt surreal. She had always been just another face in the crowd, but now her music had reached people far beyond her small town. Despite all the attention, she stayed humble. She still woke up early, still practiced on the same old piano, still smiled quietly when her mother peeked into the room to listen. Fame wasn't what she wanted. What mattered was that her music had spoken for her, and it had been heard. Weeks later, her teacher invited her to perform again, this time at a small community concert. It wasn't a competition or a school event, just an evening where local musicians played for anyone who wanted to listen. She agreed without hesitation. When the night came, she walked onto the stage with calm confidence. The nerves she used to feel were gone, replaced by something lighter, a quiet joy. The audience was small, maybe 50 people, but the warmth in the room felt familiar. Before she began, she took a moment to look around. She saw her mother in the front row, her teacher smiling proudly, and a few new faces waiting to hear her play. She spoke briefly into the microphone. "This song is special to me," she said softly. "It's about learning to be strong even when things seem impossible. I hope it means something to you too." Then she began to play. The first note filled the air, smooth and gentle. Her hands moved gracefully, her expression calm but full of emotion. The music wasn't rushed, it breathed, it lived. Every note seemed to tell a piece of her story without needing words. The crowd listened silently. Some closed their eyes, some smiled, and when she reached the final chord, the same hush filled the room as before. That beautiful moment of stillness when time seemed to pause. Then came the applause, soft at first, then louder until everyone was on their feet. Afterward, people came up to thank her. An older man with tears in his eyes said, "You reminded me why I loved music when I was young." A young girl told her, "I want to play piano like you someday." She smiled at each of them, grateful but almost shy. That night, as they drove home, her mother looked over and said, "Do you realize how many people you've touched?" The girl looked out the window, watching the streetlights blur past. "It doesn't feel real," she said. "I just played," her mother smiled. "You didn't just play. You shared a piece of yourself." That's what people felt. Over the next few months, her life slowly began to change. She was invited to perform at other schools and small events. Her teacher helped her apply for a scholarship at a nearby music academy. When she received the acceptance letter, she held it in disbelief. The night before she left for the academy, she sat at her old piano one last time. The room was quiet, filled with the same soft ticking of the clock and the faint hum of the refrigerator from the kitchen. She ran her hand along the edge of the piano, tracing every small scratch and dent, memories hidden in each one. Her mother came and stood beside her. "You're ready," she said softly. The girl nodded. "It feels strange leaving this behind." "You're not leaving it," her mother said gently. "You're carrying it with you." She smiled and pressed one final chord, deep, warm, familiar. The sound lingered, then faded. As she packed her things the next morning, she glanced at the piano again before stepping out the door. "Thank you," she whispered. At the academy, everything felt new. The big buildings, the echoing hallways, the sound of instruments being practiced from every corner. It was overwhelming at first, but she felt ready. Her first performance there wasn't in front of family or friends, but she played with the same heart. When she finished, her new instructor looked at her thoughtfully and said, "You play like someone who's lived through something." "That's rare," she smiled, not explaining. She didn't need to, because she knew now that music wasn't about being perfect. It was about connection, about telling the truth without words. And she had finally learned how to do that. Even years later, whenever she walked onto a stage, she carried a piece of that small school recital with her. The lights, the nerves, the decision to stop playing safe and play with courage. It had shaped her forever. And every time her hands touched the piano, she remembered that night, that moment when the room went silent, and she realized she could still play, not just music, but life itself. Years passed, but that night at the recital never left her. No matter how far she went, no matter how big the stage became, she always carried that moment. The trembling hands, the quiet before the music, the sound of the crowd rising to their feet. It wasn't fame or success that stayed with her. It was that first realization that she was still capable of something extraordinary, even after believing she wasn't. Her days at the academy were full of long practice hours and new challenges. The teachers were strict, the competition intense, but she had learned to move through pressure with calm focus. She didn't play to impress anymore. She played to express, and that difference showed in every note. At first, she was just another student in a sea of talented musicians. But little by little, people started noticing something in her playing, a kind of emotion that couldn't be taught. Her classmates would sometimes gather outside the practice room, quietly listening through the door as she played late into the night. One of her instructors once told her, "You play like the notes are alive." She didn't fully understand what that meant at the time, but she appreciated the words. Outside the academy, life was still simple. She lived in a small dorm room with a single window that looked out over the courtyard. On quiet mornings, she'd sit by the window with a cup of tea, watching the light move across the floor. The world seemed softer then, calmer, a place where music could breathe. She kept in touch with her mother, calling every few days. They would talk about small things, the weather, what she was practicing, how her old piano at home still sat in the corner waiting for her. Sometimes her mother would say, "The house feels quiet without your music." And she would promise, "I'll come home soon and fill it again." Her teacher from her old school also kept in touch. She sent letters occasionally, often including newspaper clippings about new students or events. In one letter she wrote, "You've become an example here. Every time a student says something is too hard, I tell them about you." Those words made her smile every time she read them. As months turned into years, her performances grew bigger. She began to travel with small ensembles, playing in towns and cities she'd never seen before. Each concert hall felt different, some large and grand, some small and intimate, but the feeling of sitting at a piano was always the same. She began to realize that her story wasn't just about her anymore. After each performance, people would come up to her, often emotional, sharing their own experiences of loss, fear, or struggle. They'd tell her that her music helped them feel something they hadn't felt in a long time, hope. And every time, she'd listen carefully, touched by the honesty in their words. One evening, after a concert in a nearby city, a young man approached her. He looked nervous, holding a worn-out notebook. "I just wanted to thank you," he said quietly. "I was in an accident a year ago and lost movement in my hand. I didn't think I could play again. But when I saw your video, I decided to try. It's not perfect, but I can play again now." She didn't know what to say at first. Tears filled her eyes as she smiled and said, "Then you understand. It's not about being perfect. It's about finding your way back." Moments like that reminded her why she played. The music had become a bridge between her heart and others, something that went beyond words. As time went on, her reputation grew quietly. She wasn't a celebrity or a star, but in the world of music, people knew her name. Her performances were described as emotion in motion, and critics often wrote about the way her playing seemed to speak. But she stayed humble. She always believed that music was something to share, not to own. Eventually, she was invited to perform at a major recital in a large city concert hall, the biggest stage of her life so far. The audience would include teachers, students, musicians, and even a few well-known composers. It felt like a dream, but also a test. In the days leading up to it, she practiced every morning and every night. Still, she made sure not to lose herself in the pressure. On the day of the performance, she took a long walk through the park, listening to the sound of leaves brushing against each other. She thought about her journey, the accident, the pain, the night she decided to play again. It all led here. When the time came, she stepped onto the stage calmly, her posture steady, her face serene. The lights were bright, but she didn't notice them. The piano waited in the center, polished and shining. She took a deep breath and sat down. As her fingers touched the keys, a familiar warmth spread through her. She didn't think about the audience, the critics, or the expectations. She thought about that small school auditorium, her teacher's soft encouragement, her mother's proud smile. She thought about the first time she realized she could still play. The music began softly, then grew, flowing through the hall like water. Each note told a story of pain, patience, love, and courage. The room was silent except for the sound of her playing. Some people closed their eyes. Others sat still, barely breathing. By the time she reached the final note, she felt at peace. She let her hands rest gently on the keys for a few seconds, then lifted them slowly. The silence that followed was almost sacred. Then, as before, the applause began. Soft at first, then thunderous. She stood, bowed, and smiled, not just to thank the audience, but to thank life itself for giving her another chance to play. That performance changed everything. It was recorded and later broadcast on television and online. Messages poured in from around the world, people thanking her for her courage, for her story, for her music. But what touched her most wasn't the attention. It was how many people said they found hope in her journey. She was invited to give small talks and workshops, often to young musicians who were struggling. She never spoke like a teacher or a celebrity. She spoke as one of them, someone who understood what it felt like to lose faith in yourself and then find it again. In one talk, she said something that stayed with many who heard it. When I couldn't play, I thought I had lost everything. But the truth is, I hadn't lost music, I had lost belief. Once I found that again, the music returned on its own. Years later, when she finally returned home for a visit, the town felt smaller, quieter, but full of memories. Her old piano still stood in the same corner, a little dustier but still beautiful. She ran her fingers along its edge, smiling. Her mother joined her in the room. "It's still waiting for you," she said softly. The young woman laughed. "I don't think it ever stopped." She sat down and began to play. Not a complicated piece, not something grand. Just a simple tune, slow and warm. Her mother listened quietly from the doorway, her eyes glistening. The sound filled the small house, wrapping it in comfort and nostalgia. When she finished, she turned to her mother and said, "This is where it all began." Her mother nodded. "And this is where it will always belong." That night, as she sat by the window watching the moonlight spill across the floor, she thought about everything she had been through, the struggle, the fear, the triumph. She realized that her life had been a lot like music, full of pauses, changes in rhythm, moments of quiet followed by bursts of sound. But through it all, it had never really stopped. She began to write a small journal, filling it with her thoughts about music and life. One line stood out among them. "The hands that once failed me became the hands that found me again." Over the next few years, she continued performing, but also began teaching. She wanted to help others discover what music could mean for them, not just as art, but as healing. Her students quickly learned that she wasn't strict, but she was honest. When they made mistakes, she didn't scold them. She reminded them that music wasn't about being flawless, it was about being real. One of her students, a young girl who had just started learning, once said, "When I play, I feel scared." She smiled and said gently, "That means you care. Keep playing until the fear becomes sound." And that became her way of teaching, turning fear into music, silence into courage. As the years went on, she played in many places, concert halls, schools, hospitals, even small street corners during festivals. But no matter where she was, her purpose never changed. She played not to impress, but to connect, to remind people that even broken things can make beautiful sounds. One day, a reporter asked her, "What do you remember most from that first recital, the one that made you known?" She paused, thinking for a moment, then smiled softly. "It wasn't the applause," she said. "It was the silence before it. The moment I realized I could still play, that I still had something left to give. That's the moment that changed everything." And that was the truth she carried with her for the rest of her life. Whenever she walked on stage, whether it was in front of 10 people or 1,000, she always began the same way, by closing her eyes for a second and whispering, "Thank you," because she knew the music wasn't just a gift she gave to others. It was a gift that had saved her first. And as the years passed, people continued to tell her story. The girl who was told to play a simple tune, but instead filled the room with deafening applause. Yet those who truly knew her understood that the real applause wasn't the sound of hands clapping. It was the quiet echo of her own heart, finally in tune with itself.